Good morning, everyone. My name is Leah Stokes, and I'm an associate professor at UC Santa Barbara, where I work on climate and clean energy policy. And for some strange reason, you all decided not to see the celebrities and instead come to a talk about energy this morning. So I don't know what that says about you, but here we are together learning about the energy system rather than seeing some fancy famous people. So today's talk is called The Future is Electric, and I'm going to talk to you about the climate problem and its solution, and so much of it has to do with one thing called electricity. Guess what the number one question is that people ask me? This is the audience participation time. What do you think? What do you think the number one question is that people ask me? Do I have an electric car? Not quite, but you're on the right track. What can I do about climate change? People are freaked out. They know that climate change is happening. They can see it with their own eyes. And they constantly ask people like me, what can I do? And you know what the answer that's given to these people is? Oopsie. It's this. Plant trees, drive less, no plastic, eat less meat, and reuse water. And you know what the one thing that isn't on this slide that's actually the number one thing that people think that they can do about climate change? We're going to say it on 3. You ready? 1, 2, 3. Recycle! Yes, some of you got it. Exactly. And recycling is not the number one thing you can do about climate change, guys. I hate to be the bearer of bad news this morning. So climate change is a complex problem, right? We see these graphs that show us the different greenhouse gases that exist. There's, of course, carbon dioxide, but there's also methane, aka fossil gas. We've got nitrous oxide, HFCs. And these pollutants come from a wide variety of sectors, whether it's agriculture, our buildings, our transportation system, our electricity system, and even our heavy industry. So you can feel like, wow, this climate problem is complicated. I don't know how we're going to solve it. So much pollution, so many kinds from all over the place. Well, I'm going to give you a framework today that simplifies this problem. And it really comes down to 2 things: clean electricity plus electrification. So let's look at the United States greenhouse gas pollution. It, of course, comes from the electric power sector, from transportation, driving cars, from buildings like the one we're in, heating and cooling it. Heavy industry is a really big chunk, and then we have agriculture. So how are we going to clean up this mess? Well, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to get to 100% clean power. And that will cut about 25% of our carbon pollution. We're going to use that clean power to drive things like cars and trucks. And that's going to clean up another quarter of the problem through electrifying our transportation sector. We're going to electrify our buildings through my favorite technology, a heat pump that's going to heat and cool our buildings, no fossil fuels required. And it turns out we can electrify about half of heavy industry. So often when we talk about heavy industry, we think about cement and steel and all these really hard to decarbonize sectors. But there's also things like food and beverage that can actually be electrified fairly easily. And what did I just show you here? I took a really complex problem, and I told you that if we get 100% clean electricity and we combine it with electrification, we can solve 3/4 of the climate problem. So suddenly this thing that feels really complex and overwhelming gets a lot simpler. Another way to think about this is that everything that runs on fossil fuels, everything that comes with a flame that we burn, coal, oil, gas, we got to turn it into electricity. Now, when do we have to do this by? Well, we have to do it as soon as possible. That's the key thing, because all of us know that climate change is not a problem that we could do when we get around to it. Procrastination is rather deadly when it comes to the climate problem. And so we've got to clean up the power sector as soon as possible. I'm going to talk you through what that looks like as the first step of this clean electricity plus electrification equation. You're probably familiar with the tools and technologies that we have to clean up our power sector. The things that come to mind are no doubt solar photovoltaics, solar energy, right? And things like wind energy. These two technologies are probably going to do a lion's share of cleaning up our electricity system. And we're seeing a really fast pace, both of deployment of these technologies and cost declines, where they are getting cheaper and cheaper. Right now, for example, almost in every corner of the country, you could shut down a coal plant tomorrow and replace it with a wind project, and people would save money on their energy bills. Because the coal plants that we are keeping open, they're actually more expensive to operate than a new wind project. And you might say, well, why do we do that? Well, because there's a difference between what the utility wants you to do and what you want to do as the customer. And so we're keeping open these dirty coal plants, even though they're poisoning our lungs, destabilizing the planet, and costing us money. But wind and solar are not the only part of the solution when it comes to clean electricity. We also have hydroelectric power, geothermal, wave energy, and tidal. And I put these on the second level because they are harder to develop. Most of the hydropower in this country was developed decades ago. At the most, we could maybe increase hydropower from around 10% of our mix today to 15%. So increase it by about 50%. Geothermal is a great technology, but again, it's somewhat limited. And things like wave and tidal energy, they have some promises, but they also tend to break a fair amount in the salty water when they're moving around. And so that is a relatively challenging technology. And finally, there's another set of technologies that could be part of our future, but it's a little bit unclear how much they will. Nuclear, of course, is a big part of our current carbon-free electricity system, but it turns out that it's quite expensive to build nuclear power plants, and we haven't been building very many of them. So our nuclear fleet is quite old and potentially starting to retire. And of course, we have this idea of hydrogen. But the thing is that hydrogen, right, has many problems associated with it. And it's going to be extremely important that the way that we make hydrogen is from using renewable electricity, what's called green hydrogen. And getting that right to make sure that hydrogen is more of a storage technology and not another pollutant is going to be a big challenge. So these technologies are less certain in terms of how they're going to play a role in our electricity mix. So what does the electricity system look like today? If I told you that those are the solutions, where are we at in this moment? Well, I can put up a chart like this, which has a lot of different colors. You see coal and gas that make up a big chunk of the electricity system. The orange slice is nuclear. It's another really big chunk. And then we start to move into what we would traditionally call the renewables. Wind, hydropower, solar, right? Geothermal's there too. And you can see that they don't make up as much as you would hope in this moment. And so right now, our electricity system is about 60% dirty nationwide and 40% clean. And what we have to do is transition that rapidly to 2035, where we are at 100% clean power. That is no easy feat. I talked about this several years ago as a really big challenge, and somebody, looking at a graph that I made, decided to call it the narwhal curve. So here we are with the narwhal curve, and you can basically see behind that narwhal is the history of our electricity mix, how much nuclear, hydro, and renewables we had in a given year. And you can see here that it doesn't exactly grow very quickly, does it? And if we want to be on track to hitting that target, we have a really steep slope to climb. And you'll also note that it's not just, in some sense, 100% clean electricity that we want to get to. It's actually 150%. Why? Because as we electrify our buildings and our transportation system, parts of heavy industry, we're going to need more electricity, aren't we? So we don't just have to rebuild the electricity system at the size that it is today. We actually need to increase it, maybe by 50% or even more. The good news, however, is that a lot of these new machines that we're going to be running on electricity are actually very efficient, meaning they don't use that much power. If you put a heat pump in your home, it doesn't actually use much energy because it moves energy around rather than burning something to create heat to warm your home. And that means it's not having a lot of waste in the process. So where are we at with this goal? Well, President Biden, you may have heard of him, rather important person. He has set a couple goals in his time. One of them is to get to 100% clean power by 2035. And on the way to that target, he says we should hit 80% clean power by 2030. So remember, I told you we're at about 40, which means we basically have to double clean electricity within the decade. And I don't know if people are keeping track of the date, but it is 2023 now. So the time is running short, and we have a lot of progress yet to make. You may have heard that this summer we passed a very important climate law called the Inflation Reduction Act. And the good news is that modeling suggests that we can get a bulk of the way there with that new law. But there's still important things we have to do to close that gap. Because right now we might be on track to something like 66% clean power, 2/3 clean power by 2030, not quite 80%. So how do we close that gap? What needs to be done in the electricity sector to make sure we're on track? Well, the first thing is we need President Biden and the Environmental Protection Agency to set ambitious carbon pollution standards for new and existing power plants. This is some weedsy stuff, but actually very important. We have a law in this country. It's been around quite a while, longer than me actually, this particular law. It's called the Clean Air Act. And there's actually a requirement based on legal precedent that we use this law to regulate greenhouse gases, to deal with carbon pollution. And so the Biden administration has the requirement to set these standards, to say, can you pollute at the same level from existing plants, those coal and gas plants that are already out there in the world belching away, and the new plants, the about 220 proposed gas plants that exist in this country right now. The second thing we have to do, and you may have heard of this one, and Texas is actually one of the big leaders of this in the United States, is we have to expand transmission capacity. We need to have a way to bring all this clean power from where it's being generated to where it's being used. And if we don't build that transmission, we may not hit the targets that we need. A lot of the projects are actually already in the queue. People want to build wind and solar. They can make money doing it, and it's much better for the planet. So we've got to speed up interconnection so that all of these projects that folks want to build can actually be connected to the grid. And we have to make sure that we're on an even playing field here. Right now, all across society, we actually subsidize fossil fuels. I mean, we're in Texas, so perhaps that's quite believable. But we are giving money still to make fossil fuels cheaper. We have to stop doing that and make it an even playing field so that clean energy can compete. The Inflation Reduction Act, that amazing, huge law that I'm happy to talk about more in the Q&A, it has to actually be implemented, right? Turns out that the words on paper when you pass a law are not quite as specific as what you need to implement it. And so we have to make sure that the Biden administration goes fast and goes effectively when it comes to implementing that law. And finally, at the state level, that's where we've seen so much progress to date on clean electricity. And we need states to keep stepping up. To say, for example, as Minnesota raced ahead and did right at the beginning of this year, that they want to move to 100% clean electricity as fast as possible. So that's the four-part plan to get the clean electricity system going on the pace and scale that's necessary to reach 80% clean power this decade and 100% clean power by 2035 in line with President Biden's goals. But that's not the whole thing we have to do, right? I told you there were 2 steps. It is climate change after all. It can't be too simple. It has to be somewhat overwhelming. So the second step is to electrify everything. And whenever you say this, people are like, but you can't electrify everything. So for those reply guys in the room, don't worry. I got to electrify everything that we can, okay? So you may know this thing. It lives in your house, potentially. It mostly lives in your house, evidently, if you live in California like I do, or in New York. What is this? It's the gas stove that you've been hearing so much about lately. That roommate that poisons you in the night. Turns out that you are burning fossil fuels in your own home with a gas stove, and that's not the only way you're doing it. You got one of these things too. What's that? That's a furnace. Your furnace could be running on gas, Some people, it's running on propane or oil, which is actually quite expensive. And you do another thing in your house, don't you? You take hot showers. How dare you? Those hot showers are often heated with fossil fuels. So what I like to say is that so many of us are actually running fossil fuel power plants. We just didn't notice it. Wait a second. I got a bunch of fossil fuel machines in my home. I even have a car in my driveway, and it burns fossil. Am I a fossil fuel plant manager? Shit. Well, don't worry, my friends. I'm not going to leave you like that. I'm going to help you figure out how to get out of that expensive business that doesn't have a very bright future. And you know how you can do it? You can get an induction stove or even an electric stove, good old-fashioned electric stove. Induction stoves are great. Everybody's been talking about them lately. I have one myself, so I'm not just trying to tell you something I wouldn't do myself. And they boil water twice as fast, and they don't poison you in the night. They're great. You could also get a heat pump and a heat pump hot water heater, and both of those things plug into the wall. And similarly, they don't poison you in the night. So this is the way that you can actually take your fossil fuel power plant and divest from the industry, so to speak. Say, you know what? I can't work in this industry anymore. I refuse to be a fossil fuel plant operator. I'm going to run my clean power machine. My home is now running on clean electricity. And it's not that hard, right? I mean, it does take some time. I'm doing it in my own house. Sometimes you have to do electrical upgrades. Sometimes you need to increase the amount of energy coming into your home. But more and more technologies are available today that are affordable. There are heat pumps, for example, that can just go into the windowsill, just like one of those air conditioning units. And they're not even ugly like those air conditioner units are. And I'm sure you've heard this before, given how popular this has been as an area of conversation. I've been talking about how gas stoves are poisoning you before it was cool, guys. But basically, we've learned from scientists for decades that burning gas in our home is like living with a smoker. And you might say, I don't believe the science. So do your own citizen science. These days, a lot of people have indoor air quality monitors in their own home because of the COVID pandemic. You can just look at that, see what's the particulate matter looking like, what's the CO2 looking like, how does it change after I cook a meal? And you will be disturbed because it goes very, very high. And just like you wouldn't like it if a friend came over and started smoking in your living room, that wouldn't be very acceptable. That is what you're doing with your gas stove. And, you know, there was a time at which we did go to people's living rooms and smoke. I've been watching TV shows based in the 70s, and some of you existed in the 70s, unlike me. And so you know what I'm saying is true. People smoked in homes, right? Do you do that now? Some people do, but it isn't considered very polite. And the same thing is going to start happening with gas stoves. People are going to ask themselves, why am I using fossil fuel appliances that create such toxic levels of air pollution in my home? Now, there are a lot of these machines. I work with an organization called Rewiring America, which has a mission to electrify all the machines in America. And so the first thing that organization did was it counted all the machines. And there's rather a lot of them. We've got almost 100 million space heaters. So those are like those gas furnaces that we're talking about, or oil propane furnaces in some parts of the country. We've got gas dryers, about 20 million. We've got another 100 million of those gas cooktops that is such a hot topic these days. We've got more than 100 million gas water heaters. And there's these things called cars. It's a new technology, just got on the road recently. They also burn fossil fuels, and there's 220 million of those. Plus, we've got these things called power plants. Those are really big sources of pollution. There's about 3,400 of those, fossil fuel power plants. So, okay, wow, that's a lot of things. And these objects, they last a while, don't they? So, a HVAC system, something to heat your home, it lasts 15 to 30 years maybe. Could be longer in some cases. A gas stove can exist for about 15 years until you start to click it on and it doesn't light. And then you think, wow, there's literally toxic gas coming out while I try to light this thing. You start to wonder if you should maybe get an induction stove. But there'll be 15 years before that happens. A car can last 12 to 20 years. A dryer, about a dozen years. The same for a water heater. And then we got the big kahuna in the room, the actual fossil fuel power plant. And that can last 30 to 60 years. So when I told you that there were 220 proposed gas plants in this country, think about that. If we were to build those 220 gas plants and operate them for 30 to 60 years, what would happen to all those sweet targets that all those corporations and governments have been setting about net zero carbon pollution by 2050? We may not make those targets, right? So we have to stop building new fossil fuel equipment because all of it lasts quite a long time. Every time one of these machines dies, it needs to be replaced by a clean alternative because we don't have time to waste. I like to think that every time a new gas furnace goes in, a ferry dies. Because we just lost maybe 30 years of carbon pollution. So the big takeaway is that we have 1 billion machines in this country alone that run on fossil fuels. And I haven't even talked about all of them. Some of them are, for example, leaf blowers in your neighborhood on a Saturday morning. I experienced that myself. Now, don't worry, you can still get an electric leaf blower if you feel passionately about continuing to use that object on a Saturday morning. And we've got no time left to waste, right? Because if I told you that it's the year 2023, and I reminded you that hypothetically by 2050 we weren't supposed to emit carbon pollution anymore, well, we don't really have the time to be putting in these machines. And if we do it anyway, what happens? We're just lighting piles of money on fire because those machines will have to be retired before they come to the end of their useful life. And that's a waste. The good news is that we are starting to see an inflection point in so many of these technologies. I heard, for example, yesterday that in California, 25% of new auto sales right now in the last quarter were electric vehicles. I'm sure even in Texas, you drive down the road, you see an electric vehicle every day. I got picked up in one yesterday at the airport, for example. So we are seeing these clean energy technologies become the dominant choice because they're cheaper, they're cleaner, and they're fancier, they're better. Heat pumps, for example, last year, for the first time, outsold gas furnaces. Why is that? Well, because a heat pump can both heat and cool your home, doesn't poison you in the night, and it's a very cool machine. So where are we at in terms of the stock, the amount of dirty machines we have versus the amount of clean machines we have? Well, let's look across a bunch of those machines. Remember I told you we've got like 100 million of this and 200 million of that. So when it comes to furnaces, we've maybe done about 10% of the problem. We have a bunch of efficient electric heat pumps, just not as many as we need. When it comes to water heaters, there is actually a yellow line there. You just can't see it. We are only at the beginning of the water heater HVAC revolution where we put in heat pump water heaters. And the cool news is that there have been some big innovations in recent years where you can actually plug into an existing wall socket a heat pump hot water heater without having to upgrade that particular outlet. So that market is poised to take off. Despite all the conversation about gas stoves and the culture war, turns out that most of our gas stoves are in the lefty states, California and New York. And a lot of people already cook on electric machines. And finally, we got those cars, quite a lot of them. And although we are starting to deploy electric vehicles, we do have a long way to go. We can think about this in terms of stocks and flows, right? So a stock is the amount that you actually have at any given time. And the flow is the amount that you are turning over in a year. So let's look first at these flows. Right now, for example, heat pumps are about 20% of the market. Although, as I've showed you, this is already out of date. They're starting to take over gas furnaces and sell at a higher rate. So the thing is that even if we sell these gas furnaces, I mean, we sell these electric heat pumps. They're going to go into a market that already has a lot of gas installed. And so it's going to take a while for heat pumps to fully overtake those gas appliances. This is work, again, by Rewiring America. And you can notice that it takes an S-curve, which is the way the technology tends to get adopted, whether that is a cell phone or a computer or a heat pump. And you can see here that if we want to get to 100% clean heating by 2050, we have a really aggressive adoption schedule we need to be on. We've got to be hitting 100% heat pump sales by 2030, by 2035, for example. And right now, we've got one state, California, with Governor Newsom saying that he doesn't think we should be selling these gas appliances after 2030. But we need more and more places to realize that if we keep installing fossil fuel machines, not only are we killing fairies, we are also blowing our carbon targets. I got another piece of really cool news for you, which is that these machines get cleaner every year. It's like magic without Harry Potter required. When you put a gas furnace in your home, that's as efficient as it's ever going to be. The first day and the last day, it's going to burn a ton of gas. If you put a heat pump in your home, what's it powered by? Electricity. And what's happening to that electricity system? We talked about that. It's getting cleaner. So if you were to calculate the amount of pollution that the heat pump emits in year one, and then fast forward 10 years when we're at maybe 80% clean power, on the road to 100% clean power, that heat pump gets cleaner. In fact, if you, for example, drive an electric vehicle right now in Vermont, you basically don't emit carbon pollution. Why? Because Vermont has a 100% clean grid. And this is the kind of future. I'm not telling you don't dry your clothes, don't cook your food, don't drive anywhere. Go for it, my friends. But let's do it in a system that doesn't emit pollution along the way. The good news is that we have had landmark federal legislation called the Inflation Reduction Act. And it has a lot of money to accelerate this transition, including at the household level. There's $9 billion that's going to be going out the door, particularly for moderate and low-income folks, to help them electrify their homes, to help them get that fancy induction stove and heat pump hot water heater and heat pump HVAC, right? And for those of us who are potentially on the wealthier side of the spectrum, I'm not making any assumptions, but here we are today on a Saturday at South by Southwest, so I imagine some of us are maybe eligible for tax credits. And the cool thing is that now, if you would like to put a heat pump in your home, you can get $2,000 off with a federal tax credit. And then the next year, if you'd like to put a heat pump hot water heater in your home, you can get $2,000 off again. And I don't want to be against insulation. Would you like to put some nice hat on your house, aka insulation, in your attic? I support you. You can get $600, no, you can get $1,200 off of that. That sounds great. And you've probably also heard that there's now money to help you get an electric vehicle. I recently discovered that that's been estimated at $9 billion. But the thing about these tax credits is they're uncapped. What does that mean? It means that we can spend as much money as the American people want to. As many people as raise their hand and say, yes, I want a heat pump. Yes, I want a heat pump hot water heater. Yes, I want an electric vehicle. We can spend that money with the tax credits. There's no limit to that. And so it is scored, meaning we're making an estimate that we're going to spend $9 billion on EVs in the next 10 years. Ha, ha, ha. I'd put a zero on that. We're probably going to spend something like $100 billion on electric vehicles. And that all comes down to what everyday people choose to do. If they think about electrifying their lives because they know they want to make a difference, and they understand that it's not about recycling or even, to a large extent, eating less meat. All these things that get talked about for the climate movement. No, 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 my friends, it's about electrification. Now, how on earth do you figure out how much money you could get? I told you some numbers, but you're going to forget. Well, you can go to rewiringamerica.org, and they've made this handy-dandy calculator where you can put in your zip code, you can put in your income, and they'll tell you how much money you're eligible to get to electrify your lives. And this tool is only going to get cooler because in the summer, they're going to actually help you, for example, connect to contractors so that if you actually want to do it, there are people who are ready to go and come to your home and electrify it. And I know we could still have some renters in the room. Do we have any renters in the room? Anybody renting? Nice. And you might say, this is brutal, man. My landlord. How am I going to convince him to get an HVAC? Well, I've often talked about this with folks, and they send me pictures like this. What is it? It's a DIY electrification in a rented home. You put a little electric toaster oven on top of your gas stove, you get an induction cook plate, bada boom, bada bing, you're electrified. And by the way, I just saw yesterday, those induction cook plates, you can get them for $40. And you don't have to leave them with the landlord. You could say, this is coming with me. So I hope that this talk has helped you ask this question and answer it in a slightly different way. First of all, it's not what I can do about climate change. It's what we can do about climate change together. The biggest things that we can do is actually work with others to change systems. And that's what I've been busy doing, helping to pass, for example, the Inflation Reduction Act. Because although I am electrifying my own home, I know that there are really big levers that I can pull called policy change or community change that can help electrify other people's homes too. And when you try to answer this question about what can you do, I hope you don't say recycle, because that's the wrong answer. That is not the thing you can do about climate change. Although I will tell you, I have been known to pick aluminum cans out of a garbage can because those are the most recyclable materials. Aluminum is very recyclable. So I still support you. Recycle. Don't stop doing it. But think about how you can remove fossil fuels from your life. Think about how you're operating a power plant. And you don't have to do that anymore. You can career switch and have an electric home instead. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions. Oh, and for those of you leaving, there's a book signing later. And I think we're doing Slido, which, how does Slido work? Let's find out together, my friends. OK, we're going to do microphones. Go for it. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the great talk. We're from Brazil here, from a construction company called Uni. So we build like 10 buildings a year. And I wanted to leave here with practical tips of what we as residential building leaders can do for electrifying and to make it cleaner, the buildings cleaner.
Well, you are a really important person, my friend. So much for the celebrities. You're building buildings. That's what I love. So it's super important to try to electrify those buildings from the start. Do not put gas appliances in the building. Put in efficient HVACs. And that is getting cheaper and cheaper to do. At least in the United States, it's pretty much the same cost or even cheaper to build a building that's all electric from the start by putting in those heat pump hot water heaters, heat pump HVACs, and induction stoves, because you don't actually have to run the gas infrastructure to it in the first place. So these technologies are getting cheaper, and I would highly recommend that you look into them. And of course, we can't leave insulation on the table there, right? Putting in good quality windows and doors, good quality insulation, that's the kind of thing that will really pay you back in the long run. So, you've got a really important job. Building a building is critical for the climate crisis, and we need folks like you to be asking these questions and making sure that we're not locking in more fossil fuels for the future.
Great, thank you.
Thanks so much.
Hi, I'm restoring an old house in the Canaan Valley region of West Virginia, and I've been very good about selecting electrification. I have options of electric or gas, but I'm almost crying because I put in a Generac gas backup generator because I was thinking, that would be nice to have, especially where I live in West Virginia with all the snow and stuff. Is that emitting when I'm not using it?
So you have a gas backup in your home. So look.
It's outside.
It's outside, yeah. So look, a lot of people have backups, and I'd rather that it be a backup than it be your everyday thing, okay? So that's not ideal, but you did, it's okay. You're not getting in trouble or anything like that. It's okay. And it is probably leaking. So what we learn more and more about the gas infrastructure is that it's gas, right? Gas is hard to contain. It doesn't like to stay in a box, literally. And so it does escape in small amounts from pipes, potentially from tanks as well. So, you do your best. The good news is, in your case, it's outside the building, so it's not inside the building and leaking into your home. So that's better for your health. But yes, these fossil fuel machines, particularly gas machines, they do leak, unfortunately. And what we know is that methane, which is what natural gas is, fossil gas, it's a fairly potent greenhouse gas, right? We say it has an additional warming potential that's like 20 times bigger than a molecule of carbon dioxide. So, I would say that if you've electrified your home and you've done your best and you have a backup that's gas, that's okay. Hopefully, in the not so distant future, we'll be able to use things like an electric vehicle as backup, right? Because basically, a lot of us are going to have giant batteries sitting charged in our driveways. And what we need is a way to take that energy from the vehicle and either put it in our home or put it onto the grid. And we really need policymakers to do that.
That's also expensive as well. I'm looking at wiring for my F-150 Lightning that's coming next year.
But you're getting
oh
an
my God, it's
F-150
$8,000
Lightning
to do that.
Yeah, but look, you just got applause for getting an F-150 Lightning.
That's
so
true. That's true.
It's maybe worth it. All right, there you go. All right, next question.
Yeah,
Yes.
speaking of electric cars, as an electric car owner and evangelist, I hear a lot about my car and the battery and what's going to happen with the battery production.
Yes.
So what are some talking points or some bullets that I can use to come back at people that tell me, oh, your electric car, you think it's so great, but it's going to
It has evil lithium batteries
Exactly.
inside. You'll be shocked to hear I've heard this one before. So here's the thing. Fossil fuels are largely out of sight, out of mind. They're invisible. Think about how you interact with them. Do you see them? Do you see them around? When I tell you they're leaking in your house, do you see that? No. Just comes and goes, doesn't even tell you about it. It's really hard to see fossil fuels, and so people don't appreciate the material impact of fossil fuels, both from the extraction in terms of the sheer amount of mining that is necessary, and also the pollution at the other end, because it all disappears. Let's say you're fueling your gas-powered car. You go to a gas station, you take a nozzle, you stick it in your car. Do you see anything happen? No. It just goes into a tank, and then you drive it around, and it disappears. So you're actually using a lot of materials all the time in a gas-powered car, right? You got to keep putting stuff into it again and again and again. But people don't see and understand the huge environmental impact that has, including in the extraction. So yes, lithium mining does have an impact. But the thing is, you do it once, right? You take that lithium out, you stick it in the car, no more. That's it. You're just putting electrons in it going forward. And so it actually has, over its lifetime, a much lower impact when it comes to mining. And what we're probably going to see is innovation, where these EVs, which, by the way, are lasting much longer than people predicted, with battery lifetimes, as you no doubt know, and range much longer than people thought. So you're going to have that EV for a long time. It doesn't break as much. And then when it's done, there's going to be companies that are going to take that battery and turn it into grid storage. They're going to keep using that lithium. And we're going to have companies here in the United States that do recycling, because that's a big part of, for example, what's happening right now with the Inflation Reduction Act. So these huge societal problems about that waste stream associated with your EV, there's going to be plans for that because it's very valuable. And I would say, we do have to think about things like public transit and bikes. And folks who want to do that, I really support them. But for many of us, we're going to have cars. And it is way better from a climate perspective and also from a mining perspective to have an electric vehicle than to have a gas-powered car. And keep in mind, there's a whole industry, I don't know if you've seen them around in Texas, who is out there trying to tell us that that's not true. So sometimes these talking points get pushed by the industry as a way of saying, the fossil fuel industry, as a way of saying we shouldn't transition. So hopefully that gives you some food for thought as you talk to people about your EV going forward.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, yes.
Hi. First of all, thank you. That was a wonderful session. I work for a manufacturer of water heating and cooling products.
Wow.
Remanufacturing. So we're
Ream?
Yeah.
Oh my God, it's Ream in the room. It's like a celebrity.
Okay. No.
You remember when I told you about this new cool heat pump hot water tank that you can plug into the wall? That's them, guys. What? Amazing.
Yes. Thank you. I was actually when you said that, I was a little yay. So. Obviously, on the manufacturing side, we are putting in tremendous work to develop heat pump products. You look at the IRA and some of these other measures that are pushing on that consumer pull side to say, hey, be selecting this, make these choices. The gap, though, that I see is from all of our consumer studies and journeys and things, when you look at who's the decision maker for water heater and air appliance products, it's often that contractor who's in the middle. And the challenge, particularly on the water side, the air side's always been technical, they're used to that. On the water side, the transition from installing what we would call kind of a dumb gas tank up to the more high-tech hybrid and heat pump products, there is a learning gap there. So we as manufacturers are really investing in that, but I just wondered if you knew, is there any policy or money or anything going behind increasing that contractor installer comfort so that there's more of a pull from that base in addition to the consumer base?
Yes, so we've got to get contractors to come along with this electrification journey. And I think it's actually getting better year over year because people are demanding it, right? When we ask, what can you do? If you talk to a contractor about getting a heat pump, you're doing something. Mm-hmm. You're planting the seed in someone's mind that this is a product that they need to start offering because people want it. And we also have, for example, programs at the state level in places like Maine as well as California that offer state incentives. And sometimes those are also required to do contractor training. And so we are going to begin to have a much larger workforce of folks who are going to be offering these products at the sales point. And we need to be educating the consumers to be asking the contractors for the thing in the first place. So for example, that Rewiring America tool that I talked about, it's going to be a way that you can actually find a contractor in your area who will do the Rheem hot water tank or whatever. I'm not trying to play favorites here. Who will actually do the heat pump for you. So yes, contractor training is a really big piece of the puzzle, but I think that as more and more people demand it, it'll be easier to do. This is the same thing that played out with electric vehicles. People would go to buy a car and folks wouldn't even show them the EVs. Well, now you can't keep doing that because people want those EVs. And that really was the consumer push that did that.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Hello. I hope it's not too off topic. What's your take on carbon credit?
Carbon credits?
Yeah.
Oh, that's not off topic. Okay, so carbon offsets. You guys heard of them? Yeah? It's a way of saying that I flew here to Austin. I know, it's like, you know, it's kind of like my little gas backup system in the backyard. It's my version of that. I flew here. So what can I do about it? Well, what if I offset that? What if I paid somebody else to remove carbon or to do something to cut carbon elsewhere in the economy? And most of the way that that's happened, anybody know? Say it with me now. 1, 2, 3, planting trees. Yeah, well, here's the thing about carbon. It's from underground. I don't know if you knew that. And the problem is we dig it up, we burn it, we put it in the atmosphere, we put it in the oceans actually a lot. So now we're like, you know what? I'm going to put it in some trees. Well, that's not really like putting it back underground. I like to say that storing carbon in trees is like taking a bunch of cash and putting it in a shoebox underneath your bed. Versus if you put carbon back underground, it's like putting it in a vault, putting your money in a vault. So the problem is that those trees are burning down because climate change is real and happening now, and a lot of our forest ecosystems are being destabilized. And so if we store carbon in trees, and I love trees, don't worry, I got like, I don't know, several dozen of them myself, big fan. But if we store carbon in trees, it's not the safest place to put it. What we really need to do is put it back underground and stop pulling it up from underground in the first place. So I think that the next wave of carbon offsets are actually going to be projects that help other people electrify their lives. This is something that Rewiring America is working on. And the idea is, rather than saying, oh, I planted some trees, yay, I did the right thing, when we know from all the scientific research that it doesn't work, why not say, I paid somebody in a low-income community to help them get a heat pump hot water heater. And that cut a bunch of carbon pollution. And that was a real thing that actually cut emissions. Because I'm not interested in doing a bunch of fancy accounting and saying you offset your pollution and it doesn't actually do anything, and it sometimes even causes additional harm. So I think that offsets as a concept are great. Where they're at right now is not as effective as they could be. That being said, there are other kinds of offsets, like direct air capture, as well as destroying super pollutants, basically these molecules that warm the planet a lot. Those things are more effective forms of offsets. But we need to move beyond tree planting, despite my love of trees, because it's not really doing what we are saying it's doing.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yes.
I was a little late, so I missed your earlier comments, but I wanted to build on the question from the gentleman from West Virginia. You made a comment in response to that in terms of backups, you might be able to use your EV as a supporting mechanism. And I'm wondering if you're seeing any signals around the ability or the technology capable to allow you to take your excess capacity and share or sell that, similar to the way we do it on today's grid.
Yeah, this is happening more and more. I live in Santa Barbara, California, and there was a proposal to build a gas plant not that far from me in Oxnard. It's a lower income community, it has a port, and they were gonna put some more pollution there, because why not? Pollution sounds good. And folks said, no, we don't want you to build a gas plant there. And so instead they said, why don't you put solar on people's roofs and include battery backup so that they can supply electricity to the grid even when the solar is not turned on. And that's what they did rather than building a gas power plant. You can sign up for a program to put solar on your roof, put a battery in your garage, and feed that to the grid during the hours of like 4 to 9 when there isn't as much electricity being produced because the sun is going to sleep. So that kind of storage and supplying to the grid is really a crucial solution that will help us avoid, for example, building power plants. Yes.
Hi, thank you. I'm Suzanne Leda. I'm with SunPower. We're a residential solar provider. And
Yes.
I just want to say, yay for everything you're doing. Really, really appreciate it. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the importance of building codes. The question from the builder I thought was totally spot on, and we see that as really, really critical. And there's so much opportunity here in this country. And then if you could speak a little bit about the incentives in the IRA for solar and battery storage for homeowners too, I think it'd be great for the audience to know. Thanks.
Yes. And I'm going to request that the people in the AV put my slides back up because I'm going to say one thing before I answer your great questions. So just so folks know, since many people are starting to go out, I'm signing books outside the book sales place, wherever that is. There's a bookstore. Okay, you people know where it is. Good job, Gold Star. And if you want to learn more about a lot of these ideas, I have a podcast. It's called A Matter of Degrees, and we actually did a mini-series called What Can I Do, where we talk about electrification. So what can you do? You can put solar on your roof. Let's start with that one. So the Inflation Reduction Act now re-upped a bunch of incentives to help you put solar on your roof. You can get 30% of the cost of that system back if you owe the federal government enough money. And so, for example, I just put solar on my roof. It's getting connected like next week, hopefully, and I can go to the federal government and get the money back as a tax credit to cover 30% of the cost of the system. And the cool thing is that also includes the battery. So I also put a battery in my home, and I can get 30% of the cost of that back. So, and if you also have to do a panel upgrade or some other additional work, you can get the 30% of that back too. Now, not everybody owes the federal government $10,000, $20,000 of money. So the cool thing is that there's additionally $27 billion in the Inflation Reduction Act for a thing called a green bank. Basically, this is going to be a way that lower income communities, affordable housing, various projects around the country can apply to get money to put solar in without having to owe that federal tax liability. And in fact, $7 billion of that $27 billion is probably going to go towards solar. So we're going to see a lot more opportunity for folks at all ends of the income spectrum to actually participate in doing solar. The second question was about building codes. Building codes, super boring, super important. Who knew? Building codes basically say, what are the rules for doing this building? And just yesterday I was on a panel with a panel manufacturer, ironic. They make a smart panel, and they were talking about how in the building code, and I've seen this myself, you know, you have requirements based on the hypothetical load of your building. So now you're electrifying, right? You came to the session, you're like, yeah, I'm in, electric future. And you got your car, you got your EV, you got your hot water tank, you got your HVAC, you got your induction stove, you're cooking with magnets, you're ready to go. But theoretically, you could turn them all on at once and your load would go really high. And so the building code will say that you need to have enough electricity coming into your home to deal with that spike. But believe it or not, we have technology that exists today that means that you don't need to deal with that spike, where you could have a panel, a smart panel, direct those technologies so that it says, you know what, EV, you're not going anywhere right now. You could just chill. Why do you need to charge right now? Or it could say, The HVAC, okay, yeah, I know it's like 67.2 degrees, but do we really have to get to 68 right now? Like, chill. HVAC, just calm down. And so it's a way to basically manage the load at the house level so that you don't have to, for example, spend a bunch of money upgrading your panel and potentially doing a bunch of trenching or additional line work that can take a lot of time and cost a lot of money. But the building code, although it's updated at the national level to allow you to use these products, it's not actually adopted at the local level. And so you could go to your city and be like, hey man, I want a smart panel. It's smart and it's a panel. And they could be like, yeah, no, you must have a giant upgrade in your panel. And so we need local cities and states to be moving on the building code of the future. We can't be hanging around with building codes from 1997, okay? We need to actually be updating them regularly so that we are incentivizing people to do all this cool stuff that we know needs to happen so quickly.
Thanks.
Thank you. All right, next question.
I'm an environmental lawyer, a partner with a law firm of King & Spalding, and I represent a lot of vehicle manufacturers, a lot of engine manufacturers, and I know we're helping them right now just to be compliant with the emission requirements, but I know many of them are very excited to move and electrify their fleet and sell more and more electric vehicles. But one challenge that I see, and also from a regulatory perspective, and I was curious to hear your thoughts, what can we do to improve the grid? What can we do to improve the availability of charging stations? So I was just curious to hear your thoughts on that. How do we get that done?
Yeah, so the cool thing is that we didn't just pass the IRA under the last Congress, we also passed the bipartisan infrastructure law, and it included tons of money for charging. So now we're going to be building out charging stations across the country at a much faster pace. And there's also been pressure on Tesla, for example, which is the company that owns the most chargers right now, to make them available to other kinds of EVs. And that is just starting to happen. So we're going to have a lot more investment in charging at the sort of public level. And there are also really cool companies like this company I learned about recently called Charger Help, which is a company that fixes the chargers, because sometimes chargers break. They have software problems, they have hardware problems, and we want to make sure that they continue to operate. So it's not just the number of chargers that we also have high quality chargers as well. So those are things that are going to be invested in by the federal government because they're kind of public goods, right? We did have one car company decide to build a giant network, but most of them are not going to do that. And so this is why, it's been so important to see what President Biden has been able to do. He's been able to pass huge amounts of investment in clean infrastructure. And I think it's going to make it a lot easier for this electric vehicle revolution to happen. And in terms of the grid, yes, we of course need to continue to make investments in the grid. But, I have an EV right now. It works just fine. Never had a problem with it. And I think that folks can kind of scaremonger about, oh, it's going to be so hard to do this, when actually people are already doing it right now. And we need to make sure that we are building clean electricity fast enough. But in my view, EVs actually make the grid more resilient. Once we get that battery to home, vehicle to home or vehicle to grid turned on, which is a really important thing to do, it means that if you've got a power outage, as we've seen happen in Texas or in California, you've got a way to power your home sitting right in your driveway. And that is really going to make EVs even more attractive to people. For example, the F-150 Lightning, I believe, is going to be sold with the ability to do vehicle to home right off the bat. So this really is the next frontier in terms of making sure we have more grid reliability, and it comes from the electrification. The electrification is actually going to make the grid more reliable.
Thank you.
All right, yes, we've got time for a couple more questions.
Our company's designing and building solar capped concrete structures that are optimized for solar capture. Where can we find out more about programs and...
From the Inflation Reduction Act?
Yeah, from the Inflation.
Okay, I got two resources for you. There's that rewiringamerica.org. There's lots of policy briefs around it. And there's also an organization called Evergreen Action. And they put out a brief that describes the entire 750-page document in understandable language. So I would go find those documents and download them, and rather than having to read 700 plus pages of legal language, you can just read summaries.
Okay, perfect.
Great, awesome. All right, yes.
Thanks so much for the talk. I'm a reporter with New Scientist magazine. Back to the Narwhal graph, is it right to expect demand for electricity to increase in that linear way? And are utilities prepared to meet that rising demand?
No, of course it's not going to be linear. It's just a sense, it's going to be like the S curve probably, like I showed earlier. It's just a sense of the pace that we need to go. Are we above the pace or below the pace? But yes, we are probably going to see increased demand for electricity. It might take a while because remember, these machines are actually pretty efficient, right? If you put a heat pump on the grid, it uses very little energy because it moves energy around rather than burning stuff to make energy. So it's an extremely efficient process. But if we put, a heat pump in 120 million homes, that's different than putting it in, 2 million homes or 5 million homes. And so as this grows, as we have more EVs and more heat pumps and more induction stoves, we are going to eventually have more demand on the grid. And of course, at the industrial scale, remember I told you about industrial manufacturing, that's a whole other ballgame. That's pretty big load that's going on the grid. So yeah, utilities are stuck in a paradigm. They have been running an electricity system that hasn't seen load growth for decades. They're not getting the fanciest talent, no offense to utilities, but people want to go work at, or at least they used to want to go work at Google and Amazon and all these fancy companies, and they're not as much going into the utility sector. And so they have a certain older way of thinking that doesn't understand the potential opportunity here. And I think we're only just beginning to see utilities understand that actually clean electricity plus electrification could be profitable for them, could be a good thing for them, rather than pain and something that they resist by saying, no, we don't want rooftop solar, for example. So we really are at an inflection point for utilities to understand that the future is electric is a good thing and that that is a way that they can actually profit. Okay, we're going to take one last question.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. It was amazing. I'm from Brazil. And talking about cars, I'm really curious to know your thoughts about if EV is the best option for a country like Brazil, where to buy an EV car nowadays is really, really expensive. So some part of the industry are trying to invest in other kind of fuels like ethanol that we have there and things like that. So I don't know if we are in the right way and if electrify our cars is the best option. Thank you.
I would say yes. I got good news for you. Technology is very expensive at one time, but then you make more of it, it gets cheaper. I don't know if you've noticed this with like cell phones. I mean, they're still expensive, but they do a heck of a lot more. They steal your attention even more than they used to, for example. Same with computers, right? So we have this thing called the learning curve in engineering, where the more we do of something, the better we get at it, the cheaper it gets. And we're seeing this happen in electric vehicles. If you bought a Tesla in the early days, maybe it cost you $80,000 or more. Now you can get one more for $30,000, and you can get cheaper cars like the Volts and Bolts and all those of the world that are even more affordable. And once we get to mass manufacturing of these technologies and we find ways to do it cheaper, it's going to get more affordable. Now, Brazil has a very long history with ethanol, for example, so there may be interests within your country that don't necessarily want to go down the electric vehicle pathway. But my bet is that this is going to be the solution all around the world. It may just take a little bit longer, given the political economy of your country. Well, I just want to say thank you so much for coming today. I'd be happy to talk to you more at this book signing, which I will be going to nowish. And yeah, I just hope that all of you will think about the things that you can do in your daily life to cut the cord with the gas company or with the oil companies. And that's really the big thing that you can do to make a difference on climate change. And it's going to take every single one of us. So thanks so much and hope you enjoy the rest of South by Southwest.